For those of us who've been working on the issues around gay public policy and law for many years, this is an amazing historic moment that we've come to talk about this evening. Many of you are familiar with the fact that traditionally homosexuality was referred to as the love that dare not speak its name. And for many of us who started doing this work 10, 15, 20 years ago, that was the way we were treated most places we went to try to speak about the issue, in courtrooms, in legislatures, to political leaders, etc. So to actually be at this moment now in 2004, where people are suggesting that an entire presidential election turned on the subject of sexuality, on the subject of gay rights, is really a rather remarkable historic moment. And I think we're beginning to assess that moment this evening. I very much look forward to all the speakers we brought together to help us do that. But I also think that we'll be assessing this moment for some time to come. Regardless of our assessment, I just wanted everyone to keep in mind at the outset that there's a sense in which sometimes publicity agents say, no publicity is bad publicity. If people are saying your name, that's a good thing. And there's a sense in which, if you keep this in a historical context of the love that dare not speak its name, the fact that the nation is talking about gay rights and having this discussion and having this debate brings us, I think, to a new historic moment that's very, very important in and of itself. And so I'm very glad to be here to listen to what our speakers have to say about that. Now, I'm going to shut up and get out of the way, let Keith Boykin run the show. I first met Keith Boykin about a dozen years ago. I don't want to age him here. When I was a lawyer at the ACLU's Lesbian and Gay Rights Project, and I was teaching law on the side at Harvard Law School, and Keith was a student in a course I taught on sexual orientation and law in 1992. That was the context in which I first met Keith. Since that time, I don't want to run over his whole resume, but those of you who don't know of Keith should. He's one of America's most important leaders in the gay community. And importantly, has been a member of many organizations, has run many organizations, and has written very eloquently about gay rights from a variety of different perspectives. But I think Keith has staked out a place for himself as perhaps the most eloquent and interesting spokesperson about the intersection of race and sexual orientation. And I feel very fortunate that we have him here tonight to moderate this program and to bring these insights. Having said that, when I think of Keith, the only thing that jumps into my head is the White House. And the reason I say that is that Keith actually worked on a number of political campaigns, helping people get to the White House before he went to law school. And then he went to law school. I had him as his 3L, 1992. He was in his third year of law school. Within a year after graduating from law school, he was working in the White House. So here was a student who sat in the back of my classroom, and the next thing I know, he's working in the White House, and he's calling me up. I'm here in the White House. We're calling you up in the White House. It's kind of amazing. And then, to make matters worse, I don't know how many of you know this, but Keith actually ran to be president of the United States this year, an American candidate. Yeah. But I would just say this. I very much look forward to the day when one of my students is the President of the United States. And I can think of no one who I think would be better at the job than Keith Boykin. So it's a pleasure to have you here tonight.
Thank you very much, Professor. I really appreciate it. It's still hard for me to call my professors by their first names. So that's good. So it's a pleasure for me to be here tonight at UCLA Law School. And I just came in from the Creating Change Conference sponsored by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force in St. Louis, Missouri, where I had expected to find a room full of despondent Democrats and progressive leftist, but instead I found a group of people who were fired up and ready to continue the struggle on LGBT issues. Not to say that everyone has the same views and values about those issues, but I hope today we have a chance to sort of clarify some of the perceptions and misperceptions about what did and did not take place in the 2004 election. And we have an esteemed panel here who can help us to do that. I have found when I walked over here that I had no idea that there was going to be so much information available to all of you that you all have here. So I don't want to belabor the process of doing long introductions, so I will just give a brief introduction of each person. The first panelist for tonight, our first panelist, is Susan Pincus, who is the director of the Los Angeles Times poll with more than 20 years of research experience. And Susan had a chance to speak with her very briefly before we came into this room. She has some interesting insights she'd like to share with us about the election. Susan.
Should I do it here or there?
You can do it there. Actually, it's probably easier. You have a microphone.
I can get out. Actually, I started when I was a child. 20 years seems so long, so old. Is this on?
Yeah, but you just might need to lean into it.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me, Brad. Attitudes toward gays in the United States have come a long way over the last 10 to 20 years. The Times poll has conducted surveys going back over 20 years, exploring attitudes of Americans toward the gay community. As recently as March of this year, the Times poll conducted a survey about gay acceptance in the wake of the president advocating a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage. The poll shows that the public appears to be more accepting and more tolerant of people in this country who are gay and lesbian than they were even a decade ago. One of the reasons for this tolerance is the fact that most people know at least one person who is gay, whether they have personal friends, co-workers, or acquaintances. For instance, in a December '85 survey, just a plurality of the public said they knew someone who was gay, compared to almost 7 in 10 today. And 20 years ago, in a September '83 Times poll, just 3 in 10 said that they were sympathetic to the gay community. Today, 6 in 10 now say they are sympathetic. Just looking at the national landscape, there are openly gay politicians, domestic partnership benefits for employees in some states and corporations, and even an openly gay daughter of the Vice President of the United States. However, all is not harmonious within different segments of the nation's population in accepting gay lifestyle in American society. There are wide generational differences between the youngest and the oldest respondents who are religious, especially Christian conservatives, those who worship frequently, as well as differences between married and single men and women. As you would expect, in general, the youngest group is more accepting of gays than the oldest respondents, probably because most young respondents know someone who is gay, while a bare majority of those 65 and over know someone. Familiarity breeds tolerance. However, the Christian conservative fundamentalists, which represent about 14% of the population, still believe that being gay is against God's will, and they are against anything that would increase acceptance and recognition of gays in society. But acceptance of gays and lesbians only goes so far, and acceptance of gay marriage is not one of them. More than 7 in 10 Americans said that they were following the news about same-sex marriage in this country. In the March poll, about a quarter believed gays should marry. In October, a fifth of Americans thought that. Roughly 2 out of 5 of those surveyed believe same-sex couples should be allowed to legally form civil unions but not marry, and a third don't want either of these things to happen. Interestingly, liberals, liberal Democrats, and Democrats with a college degree or more are the only groups that have sizable pluralities that agree that gays should be allowed to marry, while most other groups hover around the national average, except for conservatives, Republicans, respondents who are married, non-Catholic Christians, those who are religious, rural dwellers, Southerners, and Midwesterners who are staunchly opposed. Civil unions, however, are more acceptable to the population at large, especially among Democrats, moderate Democrats, older men, single men, the elderly, Catholics, the less religious, respondents who are affluent, highly educated, and suburbanites. Americans who don't accept either of these forms of partnerships are overwhelmingly Republican, conservative, and conservative Republican. Other groups that are against a union between gays, but not as staunchly as the conservative right, are married respondents, the less educated, married women, religious, rural and small-town residents, and those living in the South. As you can see, more of the public can go along with civil unions, but not marriage. Just using the word marriage evokes highly charged emotions, including the thought that it would degrade the institution of marriage. So what happened on Election Day? In a Washington Post article, the untold story of the 2004 election, according to national religious leaders and grassroots activists, is that evangelical Christian groups were often more aggressive and sometimes better organized on the ground than the Bush campaign itself. Christian activists led the charge that GOP operatives followed and capitalized upon. This was particularly true of the same-sex marriage issue. One of the most successful tactics of social conservatives, the ballot referendums against same-sex marriage in 11 states, bubbled up from below. In battleground states such as Ohio, scores of clergy members attended legal sessions explaining how they can talk about the election from the pulpit. Hundreds of churches launched registration drives. Thousands of churchgoers registered to vote, and millions of voter guides were distributed by Christian and anti-abortion groups. The rallying cry for many social conservatives was opposition to same-sex marriage. But concern about the Supreme Court, abortion, school prayer, and pornography also motivated these value voters. Same-sex marriage, said Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council, was the hood ornament on the family values wagon that carried the president to a second term. Whether evangelical turnout rose nationally this year, and by how much, is unclear. Without question, however, Bush's conservative Christian base was essential to his victory. They go on to say that according to the NEP exit poll, which is the exit poll of the consortium of the network and AP, Bush won 79% of the 26.5 million evangelical votes and 52% of the 31 million Catholic votes. Turnout soared in conservative areas such as Ohio's Warren County, where Bush picked up 18,000 more votes than in 2000, and local activists said churches were the reason. What helped propel social conservatives to change strategy and focus their attention on putting initiatives on state ballots to ban same-sex marriage was the defeat of the federal marriage amendment. To further prove this point, the Times exit poll showed that 40% of the electorate said that moral or ethical values was the most important issue when they decided on who to vote for president. Among that group, 70% voted for Bush and 29% supported Kerry. 42% said they went to religious services at least weekly, and 51% of that group cited morals and ethical values as the most important issue in deciding their candidate. Voters who were very religious and also mentioned morals and ethical values as the most important issue voted for Bush over Kerry 83 to 17%. And in the other national exit poll, 8% of the electorate said that religious faith was an important quality for their candidate to possess, and 91% of these voters supported Bush. Why, it's so much more. Morals and ethical values did play a part in this election. However, there has been some criticism about having this issue in the same list with Iraq, terrorism, and the economy. But Bill McInturf, a Republican pollster, called these criticism garbage. He goes on to say that the people who pick moral values as an issue knows what that means. It's a code word in surveys for a cluster of issues like gay marriage and abortion. It's self-selected by people for whom these issues are very important for their votes. He adds that the margin by which Mr. Bush carried these voters arguably made the difference in the election. I got to skip a lot. So having the gay marriage issue on the ballot on 11 states was not a coincidence, but a very shrewd calculating move on the part of social conservatives and the Republicans. In a Times pre-election poll conducted late last month, half of the voters favored the amendment to the U.S. Constitution that legally defines marriage as a union between a man and a woman only and would prevent states from legally recognizing same-sex marriages, including 40% who strongly favored the amendment, 43% opposed. I have to skip over a whole bunch of stuff. Another strong indicator for Bush was the voter who frequented church at least weekly. More evidence that the conservatives helped Bush is the fact that voters in this election were more conservative than liberal. Almost 2 out of 5 voters said they were politically conservative, compared to about a third who said they were liberal, and less than 3 in 10 who said that they were middle of the road. Democrats and Republicans were virtually even in their share of the voters, 40% Democrats, 39% Republicans. And in the 2000 Times exit poll, Democrats outpaced Republicans by 7 points. In the NEP National Exit Poll, 36% of the electorate were made up of white Protestant conservatives. A quarter were white born-again evangelicals, and 16% were born-again evangelicals. And more than 3/5 of all these groups are against gays either legally forming civil unions or allowed to get married. Karl Rove used Bush's conservative base as part of his winning strategy for winning the election. His goal was to energize the base. He used code words to get his base out, using activist judges, the right of every human being to have a life, invoking God, and saying that he's born again. In all 11 states where the gay marriage measures were on the ballot, it passed, including the 2 states, Oregon and Michigan, where Kerry won. Ohio, a must-win state for Kerry, was close. Bush won 51-49. And in pre-election polls in Ohio, it showed in the last week to 10 days of the election that the race was tightening. It was either close or that Kerry was ahead by 3-4 points. So you can see that helping to bring out the religious conservatives helped Bush beat Kerry. And turnout is still being counted. There are still ballots, but it's showing that in the 11 states where their gay marriage, that the turnout had increased. And unfortunately, I have to stop. But.
Thank you very much, Susan. I think we're going to have some interesting exchanges here about the views that will be expressed tonight, and that should be helpful.
We need air in here.
I remember a year ago, November of 2003, when the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court handed down this decision in the Goodridge case. At that time, and actually a few weeks before that time, Karl Rove and some others from the White House political staff predicted that gay marriage would be the defining issue of the 2004 election, the defining moral issue of the 2004 election. Time will tell whether that prediction was actually an accurate one, but we have someone here who can help us to talk a little bit more about the gay marriage issue, and that is David Sears. David Sears is a professor of psychology and political science, the former dean of social sciences, and the current director of the Institute for Social Science Research at UCLA. David Sears.
Thanks. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm not really an expert on the subject of public opinion about gays, but I can say some things about it.
Could you pull the microphone up a little closer
Sure.
to you so everyone can hear? Thanks.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So let me quickly, I just will try to make four basic points. Point one is that this election was very similar to the election of the year 2000. The most obvious to all of us, because of the media, are the similarities in the geographical pattern of support of the two parties. Only 3 states changed sides between 2000 and 2004. New Mexico, which had gone for Gore by a hair in 2000, switched very narrowly to Bush. Iowa had gone by a hair for Gore in 2000 and was won very narrowly by Bush. And New Hampshire went for Bush in the year 2000 by less than the number of votes Ralph Nader got in New Hampshire, and went relatively narrowly for Kerry in this election. So we had, in terms of changing sides, we only had those 3 states. that were close to in the last election. They're close this time, and they went slightly over the margin. So the basic geographical pattern held very closely. The popular vote was very similar also. Gore and Bush almost broke even in the year 2000. This time Bush got 51%. So the election looks a lot like the previous election, and B, the election was very close both times. And so that puts a big burden on anybody that's trying to explain this election as the product of anything very idiosyncratic to this election. It reminds me, I hate to, that Susan can claim that she doesn't go back 20 years in the public opinion business, but what it reminds me of is the first election I voted in 1960 when John F. Kennedy won and then was besieged for the next, unfortunately, only 3 years of his life, but besieged for the next 3 years by claimants that they had the decisive votes that put him over the top, and they were the ones that should get credit and those things that went along with that. So that's point one. Very similar to 2000, very close. Let's not overinterpret the results. Point two, to pick up on something Susan said, there's been a long-term trend toward more tolerance for gays and lesbians as far as public opinion surveys go. We have pretty good time series data that go back to about 1970, and you can see a long-term, rather gradual, at least gradual through the 70s and 80s and early 90s, increase in tolerance by various indicators for gays, which looks a lot like increasing tolerance that you see toward other groups that have been stigmatized in the past, such as African Americans. I was interested by Susan's point about how the increasing number of people who themselves know somebody who is gay, which, as all of you in this room, I'm sure, appreciate, probably does not reflect an increase in the number of people who are gay in this country as much as it does increasing willingness of gay people to make their sexual orientation known, which means that for the rest of us, we then know somebody. I had a graduate student who was my advisor for over a year, and he ultimately, in his second year of graduate school, he signed the ad that came out in the Daily Bruin on Out Day, or whatever that's called. I read through it out of curiosity. It was the first time they published something like that. I said, PJ, my God, PJ is gay. And I went to one of my colleagues, and he said, oh, of course PJ is gay. Are you an idiot? Well, okay, I didn't know. I didn't have a clue. And so now I'm proud to say I have a student who's gay, and he's a lovely person. So that, in terms of that, my second point then is, what are we looking at in terms of background for in terms of gay issues? One point is this long-term trend toward greater tolerance. The other is the very striking polarization about gays that Susan alluded to by, among other things, religious orientation. Now, for people like me that study elections and public opinion, religion has been a very boring variable for many years, ever since, again, 1960, when it had some life to it. But for many of those years, it has not been a sparkly issue. And now, as Susan says, it's one of the most dynamic variables in any analysis of partisanship or public opinion or elections. And you get striking polarization between, particularly, as she said, evangelicals and the more faithful, the more religious, the more observant on the one hand, and more secular people or people who are less observant on the other. And these are huge differences. I unfortunately didn't have Susan's data, but I used the field poll data from California. 80% of born-agains are against same-sex marriage, against 38% of everybody else in California. 80% of born-agains are against same-sex marriage in California, 38% of everybody else in the state. Well, that's a huge difference. We don't get differences like that in public opinion data very, very often, between blacks and whites, yes, but not very often on other demographic characteristics. So we have this long-term trend toward more tolerance, but with this very striking polarization, religious polarization in the middle of it. Now, how do these issues play out in elections according to the way political scientists think about these things? Usually, political scientists would approach an issue like this and talk about two things. One is agenda. Is this issue on the agenda? If it's on the agenda, it's more likely to play a role than if it isn't, obviously. And so then you get into campaigns trying to control the agenda. Each campaign tries to get its issues on the agenda, just as Karl Rove tried to get gay marriage on the agenda. The second concept is issue ownership. Each party owns certain issues. Certain issues are good for that party and bad for the other party. Democrats have owned Social Security for many years. They just hope the Republicans talk about cutting back Social Security. Well, gay marriage is owned by Republicans, both by virtue of the fact of the positions that the party has taken, which are hostile to gay marriage, and also because most American voters are against gay marriage. And so that makes it a ripe plum for the taking for the Republicans. So the game then is to try to control the agenda, try to tilt the agenda toward issues that you own. Now, there are two wrinkles on this that I wanted to underline. One is that there's a lot of talk in political science about campaigns trying to control the agenda or the media trying to, how much time do I have?
2 minutes.
Okay. Or the media trying to control the agenda. But then there are what political scientists call exogenous events, things that happen to the agenda without the campaign controlling it or the media controlling it. The two, my joke after the election, to the extent I could joke about anything, was that George W. Bush's two new best friends were Osama bin Laden and the person who brought the suit, the couple who brought the suit in Massachusetts to the Massachusetts State Supreme Court. Utterly not under the control of the campaign or the demon liberals in the media. These were exogenous events that came in and had a terrific influence. Second point about issue ownership is that, sure, you can own an issue, but you may not own all of it. For example, the Republicans have owned racial issues for a number of years, 20 years. They owned busing, they owned affirmative action. They just wished the Democrats would run campaigns around issues of busing and affirmative action. Do they want to run an issue around Trent Lott's nostalgic harping back to the Strom Thurmond days? Okay. Now, so the Republicans I think, got a gift in this election. If the campaign had been run around the issues of civil unions or around ordinary rights for gays, such as employment rights and stuff like that, it would not have benefited the Republicans. In fact, it might have given the Republicans an opportunity to shoot themselves in the foot by taking a discriminatory posture.
On Tuesday, November 2nd, I pulled an all-nighter, as some of you probably did as well. I stayed up until 4:30 or 4:45 in the morning, and then decided to retire for the second time in 4 years without knowing who the president would be when I went to bed. And this time, however, I woke up the next day and found out that John Kerry had conceded early in the afternoon. And I turned off the television, and I stopped watching TV for a week.
Me too.
I stopped reading the newspapers for a week until Wednesday, November 10th. So I fear that the LGBT community might be used as a scapegoat in this election. I think that Ken, our next speaker, might be able to speak to that issue as well. Ken Sherrill chairs the political science department at Hunter College, City University of New York, and he writes extensively on LGBTQI issues. Ken Sherrill.
Thank you. First, I just want to say how honored I am to be invited, and want to thank Brad Sears and Desmond Wu for the job they've done to make me so welcome at home during my visit, and I really appreciate it. I wanted to follow on Keith's memory. The last time I stayed up that late on an election night was in 1960, when I was an undergraduate and president of my college's chapter of Students for Kennedy. And I was at the time taking a 9 a.m. Introduction to International Relations course taught by Ken Organsky, who was a Russian emigre born in Italy and who spoke with one language's inflections and another's rhythms. And he had been an intense Kennedy supporter throughout the campaign. You know, he just, every class was a Kennedy lecture. It was an 11 a.m. class, and I dragged myself into school. And Ken Organsky had predicted that Kennedy was going to win by 3 million votes. And Organsky dragged himself in, and he looked at us and looked at him, and he said, "I knew that Kennedy would get the Catholic vote. I knew that Kennedy would get the Jewish vote. I knew that Kennedy would get the black vote. I forgot there are white Protestants in this country." And having learned that lesson in 1960, I've been condemned to learning it over and over again ever since. It's not easy to be objective and dispassionate when discussing an election in which the winning candidate promised to make my marriage unconstitutional. Wrong finger. These days, an openly gay Democratic Party activist must feel a bit like a corpse on an autopsy table being asked to identify the cause of the entire party's demise. And, of course, we all know that the inquiry itself is nonsense. The Democratic Party is not dead. And if anything, a stronger case can be made to contend that LGBT people contributed to its remarkable strength in this election, as can be made that we contributed to its demise. I think systematic analysis of the data will indicate that there was no net effect of the same-sex marriage issue. I think that when we look at the remarkable increase in turnout and at the extraordinary similarity of the demography of the electorate between 2004 and 2000, the story is a rising tide lifts all boats. There was a huge amount of mobilization on the part of the religious right around same-sex marriage. There also was an extraordinary mobilization on the other side. And they may well have canceled it out. In fact, George Bush had a smaller margin of victory in 2004 than did virtually all incumbents who were reelected in the 20th century. And the Republicans picked up fewer seats in the House of Representatives than one would have expected a party re-electing an incumbent president to win. I think a strong case can be made that Kerry and the Democrats did better than one might have expected when running against an incumbent while the nation was at war. Nevertheless, it's become fashionable to attack us. Your distinguished Senator, Dianne Feinstein, was quoted in my hometown paper, the New York Times, as saying that the same-sex weddings in San Francisco, quote, did energize a very conservative vote. I think that the whole issue has been too much, too fast, too soon, and people aren't ready for it. Those of us who are children of the 60s are quite familiar with the too much, too fast, too soon argument. It's no fun to hear it. I mean, it's as if the Democratic Party leadership were looking for a whipping boy, and it's the party's leaders' turn to our community. And I think if they had stopped to ask anyone in the leather community, they would have learned that a whipping is best enjoyed when the boy And in this case, there is as much evidence that the whipping is undeserved as it is that it's unwelcome. I'd like to commend to everybody a work in progress by Simon Jackman, a political scientist at Stanford, who's done a very sophisticated analysis of the data on states in which there are same-sex marriage initiatives on the ballot. And what he found was that in every one of these states, it did boost turnout, but it did not have a net impact on the intensity of the race. I mean, it had a net impact on the intensity of the race, but it did not have any impact on the change in vote for Bush compared to the Bush vote in 2000. He has, in particular, looked at Ohio and finds no evidence that the initiative turned the state to Bush. After all, Bush did carry it 4 years ago. People came out on both sides of the question. There were a lot of reasons why one would not like, if you lived in Ohio, would not like George Bush to get reelected. Look at the unemployment rate. Everybody here should have received some copies of analysis that I did for this year's exit polls for the Task Force Policy Institute. And I don't want to repeat that material at any length. You can read it when you need time to sleep. But I want to make, give you some headlines. First, for reasons that I really can't fathom, the percent of LGBT voters who supported Bush in 2004 is virtually identical to the support those who supported him in 2000. I told my students the morning after the election that this was roughly the percent of Republicans who one might expect to vote for Mao Zedong were he on the ballot. Party identification does have a tremendous impact, and people do have varying primary. But it was 25% 4 years ago. The national exit polls get 23%. Susan got about 20%.
At 18.
18%, which is. They're working with a sample size of about 125. You had a sample size of about 200.
A little more.
A little more than 200. So I probably trust your data a little bit more on that. But it's not a huge change. Well, maybe Bush lost a quarter of his support, which is extraordinary given the issue. Second, 17% of the LGBT voters said that there should be no legal recognition of our relationships. This compares to 38% of all voters. Notice in both cases it's roughly a 2-to-1 ratio, that overall in the electorate, about twice as many people voted for Bush as did LGBT people. In overall, twice as many people think there should be no legal recognition as among LGBT people. But in fact, and as everybody else has noted, the majority opposition to same-sex marriage is concentrated in the hardcore social conservatives. And these are people who would have voted for George Bush no matter what. Okay, I will see that I should stop, so I will. I'll conclude later.
Our next speaker is Russell Robinson, who's also a professor of law here at UCLA. And I found it interesting just in observing Russell's bio. Russell is teaches anti-discrimination law, civil rights law, entertainment law. But I found it interesting, the title of one of his writings, which I found here, Boy Scouts and Burning Crosses, Bringing Balance to the Court's Lopsided Approach to the Intersection of Equality and Speech. And I'm sure you're wondering what the relevance is to that, but I think Russell will be able to offer us some perspective today that can deal with the issues that go beyond equality in speech and talk about the election and the impact on the LGBT community. Russell.
Thank you, Keith, and thanks to Brad and the Williams Project for including me on the panel. It's amazing how a few days can change your opinion on an issue. I experienced this recently. A few days before the election, I was arguing with a colleague that maybe voting should be mandatory. In the aftermath of the Bush victory, I had a conversation with my sister-in-law who related a story that made me think twice about that. I asked her if she thought that the anti-gay vote had made a difference in the election, and she said that in a Dayton, Ohio beauty salon, she spoke to a woman who voted for Bush because of Kerry's gay daughter. So obviously there was a lot of misinformation going on out there. But I have a number of overlapping identities implicated by the recent election. Gay, African American, from Ohio. Also, don't blame me though. I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian community where I was told, Russell, don't you know you can't be a Democrat and a Christian? So I have some insight into, this block of voters that played some role in the election. One thing that's lost, however, in the discussion, I think, is the intersections among these various identities. When we talk about the religious vote, the black vote, or the gay vote, we tend to think that they're all separate. But as Professor Devin Carbato here at UCLA has written, the assumption underlying much of the discourse, both within the gay community and otherwise, is that the paradigmatic gay person is white and the paradigmatic black person is straight. A similar false dichotomy, I think, operated in a lot of the analysis of the election. And I want to focus on the positioning of gays and morality as if they were oppositional. In favor of gay rights, the argument goes, and this was in one newspaper, are the latte-sipping, America-bashing, amoral elitists squared off against the dumb, racist, Bible-thumping rednecks. Now, obviously, this is a caricature, but it's had tremendous traction, surprisingly, in a lot of the coverage. However, as one congressman said, there is red and blue in each of us. Gay Bible thumpers, dumb elitists, latte-sipping racists. Indeed, in yesterday's New York Times, there was a story on how evangelical Christians are gaining converts in the bluest of the blue cities, New York City, and how divorce rates are lowest in Massachusetts, the only state to approve same-sex marriage. But beyond this caricature, there are some important lessons that I think that we can learn that perhaps could point in a different direction in terms of the next election. First, the false dichotomy renders invisible the many gay people who have religious faith or a commitment to spirituality. A most distressing turn in the campaign as an African American was the Bush administration's deployment of African American ministers to rail against gay marriage. This strategy upped the ante on the already existing morality versus gay rights divide. Not only were these ministers, but they were African Americans with a connection to the historic African American civil rights movement. But how could these ministers ignore the numerous African American gay people in their churches, in their choirs, and perhaps in their pulpits? Because many of the gays in such congregations remained silent while their ministers spewed homophobic rhetoric, they abetted the erasure of their very identities as gay people of faith. A second lesson arises from the failure to frame gay rights as an issue of morality and faith. From media accounts, you might think that religion is synonymous with fundamentalism. Yet there are numerous more moderate religious denominations of various faiths that embrace gays and lesbians. Indeed, the idea of same-sex marriage could be tethered to faith and morality. Same-sex marriage could be framed as an alternative to what has stereotypically been constructed as the gay lifestyle. You can imagine trying to convince people in the red states that, look, first of all, gay people are not going anywhere. This is something that people do not choose. Then you can argue that they are in most families and communities and they're not going to be changed, so that you should offer some sort of alternative to an equal lifestyle using the kind of buzzwords. And again, these aren't arguments that necessarily we have to believe, but that might have some political traction anyway. And because marriage is thought to confer stability and connectedness and commitment, if people recognize that they have gay people in their families and in their communities, they may be willing to accept gay marriage on those terms. Even the Cheneys, I suspect, are happy that their daughter is in a committed relationship. Now, I recognize, of course, that this view of marriage is contested within the gay community and elsewhere, but the truth of the viewpoint, I think, is secondary to the political utility of it. As our beauty shop voter demonstrates, political outcomes and truth are rarely coextensive. Third, I think we can do a better job of tending the middle ground. As David suggested, there's a solid majority in support of laws banning employment discrimination, broad support for civil unions, and these can form the basis of making inroads and convincing people that they should accept gay unions. Now, I'm not saying that we should settle for civil unions, but that it could be a step toward making inroads among voters that seem to be opposed to gay marriage at present. Let me close with an episode recounted in the New York Times in which John Kerry tried to finesse the dichotomy between morality and gay rights. The setting is a town hall-style meeting in Mississippi, and I'm quoting from the New York Times. Mr. Kerry listened as a black woman angrily decried gay rights supporters for claiming the mantle of the civil rights struggle. One white man booed the woman, but Mr. Kerry held up his hands to stop the booing while a few blacks clapped. Mr. Kerry answered slowly, first laying out his minutely calibrated stance on gay marriage. I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, he said to polite applause. But I believe it's important in the United States of America that we recognize that we have a Constitution which has an equal protection clause, he said to growing applause. Then Mr. Kerry drew a connection between racism and anti-gay crime, noting the 1998 murder of a gay college student, Matthew Shepard, in Wyoming, but mangling a reference to James Byrd Jr., a black man who was dragged to his death the same year in Jasper, Texas. He said, "Let me tell you something. When Matthew Shepard gets crucified on a fence in Wyoming only because he was gay, when Mr. King gets dragged behind a truck down in Texas by chains and his body is mutilated only because he is gay, I think that's a matter of rights in the United States of America." Most in the audience cheered, but the questioner was not satisfied. She continued, "My point is homosexuality is an idea. You've never heard a doctor say, 'Mr. and Mrs. John Doe, you have a bouncing baby homosexual.' It's an idea." Mr. Kerry replied to this, "Well, I know the deep beliefs. I respect. I'm a Christian. I've read the Bible. And I know you can find that the clauses go both ways. But I'm not here to argue that with you." So I won't read the whole exchange, but the bottom line seems to be that Kerry is saying that the Bible can be interpreted in different ways, but he's not willing to engage the issue. He's against hate crimes, which doesn't distinguish him from most other politicians. He supports enforcing the Equal Protection Clause, but he thinks that that allows limiting marriage to one man and one woman. I'm hoping that by thinking critically about issues of morality and faith and openly discussing them, we can move toward dialogue that is more productive and coherent than this sort of double talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Kerry was one of the few senators who actually voted against the Defense of Marriage Act, which President Clinton signed. But then Senator Kerry also announced earlier this year that he supported the Massachusetts constitutional amendment, which would ban marriage equality. On the other side of the table, President Bush, when he was a candidate for office in 2000, met with LGBT leaders in his home state of Texas, becoming one of, I believe, the first Republican presidential candidate to do so. And this year, the log cabin Republicans chose not to endorse President Bush. So there's been somewhat of a change in the policy in the past 4 years, or the perspective of the president. And we have someone here who can help us to sort our way through those issues and talk about the election and talk about it from the perspective of a conservative. C. Martin Meekins is director for the AIDS Responsibility Project, a nonprofit entity that assists in the implementation of President Bush's International AIDS Assistance Program, and also a member of the LA Leadership Committee for Lambda Legal. C. Martin Meekins.
Thank you. I also want to thank the Senate for putting this together. I think it's a nice time, a couple of weeks after the election. There was a lot of emotion the morning after, the weeks after. But I do come from this perhaps from a little different perspective than academia, than from the left. I grew up in a small town in East Texas where people are all Protestant. And if you weren't Baptist, that meant you were Pentecostal. And if you weren't either of those, then you weren't from here. I admit to working on the Bush campaign in 2000, representing Bush thereafter in Florida with my previous law firm. And I will tell you, I was one of the board members on LCR, which very staunchly said we will not endorse a president that endorsed an FMA. And the good news is that it was a very easy vote for most of us. Liberals, Republicans, conservatives, none of us have a litmus test with respect to elections. But I think this year, this election, and the elections in a lot of different states, there's no way to sugarcoat it. And there are a lot of lessons to draw from the elections in 2004. But I will be the first to say that we lost. And when I say we, I don't mean Democrats, I don't mean Republicans. I mean the gay and lesbian community. The wedge issue strategy worked. It makes me sick. These are people that I used to work with. These are people with whom I've had conversations of don't go down this road. This strategy is unsustainable. You know, you will not have my support, and you will not have the support of others who are with you on each and every issue. You know, you're the hypocrites. We're the ones who are true to sort of a libertarian Republican Party ideal and mantle. With all that said, though, and with all the analysis, and we can extrapolate, we can play the blame game, at the end of the day, we lost. And there are lessons, I think, that need to be drawn from the 2004 election. My friends call me buzzkill when we go out during the week. But I don't like to sugarcoat things. And so I'm going to impart upon you, I think, 6 major points. And the point number 1, the GLBT community needs to focus less on New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. The battles that are being fought, if we want to talk amongst ourselves, and yeah, let's go hang out in LA, let's go to Manhattan, let's go to DC, and we can talk amongst ourselves about how we would run the world if we're in charge. We are not in charge. And as the data shows, as you know, you can pick up the phone for those of you who have family in the Midwest or friends in the South, that's where the real work needs to be done in the years to come. We cannot win equality in the way that equality is best won for all Americans in all states unless we do the work in each of those states. And in that sense, I think we should spend less time attending pretty black tie events every year and paying $200 to rub elbows and have martinis with other people who believe as we do. Perhaps our time is better spent having barbecues, going out and doing grassroots functions in Idaho, in Ohio, places where one-on-one conversations with people can make a difference. I was in Provincetown in the freezing rain all this past weekend, and I happenstance upon an HRC office. I've never seen one. Not that I was looking for one, but I thought to myself, what is it doing here? It is Provincetown in the winter, and it was open. And nothing else in Provincetown is open this time of year. But it sort of begged the question of where are we spending our resources? Where are we looking to make a difference in the hearts and minds of Americans? I wish it was easier for me to pick up the phone and start a phone tree to call 500 people to contact a congressman or congresswoman in a district than it is for me to organize a party with 15,000 people for a circuit party. You know, that's a problem. That's a problem that we as a community, we have to face. Number 2, as much as it hurts people in this audience to hear it, we need to embrace the reality that most Americans, including gay Americans, that they are people of faith. I have these conversations back home with people, and you know, it's sort of like being on Mars sometimes about, you know, what's really going on in America and what their perception of reality. But the perception is reality, right? If we want for people to understand what it is, well, first of all, who it is we are. One statistic that has not been thrown out here tonight, which I think is actually quite important, is the number of Americans who believe that being gay is a choice versus something that's part of your DNA. And those percentages pretty much correlate with a third of people who think that being gay is not a choice, and 2/3 are split between half of, you know, 1/3 who believe it's DNA and another third who's not quite sure. If you look at the breakdown of marriage, civil unions, no marriage, gay marriage, I think it'd be an interesting regressive study model just to find out if those correlate, because I think that they probably do. But in order to persuade people, you've got to talk their language. And I find that when I come from my set of values that I grew up with, and I have conversations about gay marriage. I have conversations about don't ask, don't tell. I have conversations about ENDA, that if you speak their language, they hear you. If you're not willing to speak their language, they can't listen to you. And so on a going forward basis, we have to retool the message that our community, the image that our community is projecting outward. And I think that's extremely important. It is a campaign. It is a war. And we're fighting. The third point is we are in a culture war. I don't like it when the radical right says it, but quite frankly, we've been in this for many decades, and there are people in this room that have done a hell of a lot more than I could ever do in my lifetime. But we are in a war, and that means that sometimes you play defense and sometimes you play offense. And quite frankly, I'm sick of playing defense. The way that Karl Rove was able to control the agenda this year was that they capitalized on the Massachusetts decision for their own purpose, but they controlled the debate. One of the biggest mistakes in my mind of the Kerry campaign was to either not change the landscape of the gay debate or not to take him head on it. And in the absence of a debate, not only does he control the debate, he wins. And we can say it didn't play a role in the election, but it did. It motivated millions of evangelical Christians to vote that perhaps historically they would have stayed at home. These people sometimes feel like they have no power over government, over the public in any way. And they were embrazened, and they went out, and they used the churches, and they got the vote out, simply put. So one of the things that we need to do, I think, as a community that we should have learned from this is that being on the offense has its advantages because you can sometimes control the debate. Fourth, and people will love that it's coming from me, we have a two-party system in this country. Okay? The Republicans control all branches, including the Supreme Court, if you're counting 2000 as a proxy vote for party affiliation. And that means if we are going to be successful in our lobbying efforts, we have to put more of our effort, more of our energy, and more of our money in the advocacy and legislative public policy debate in the Republican Party. Like, I can't say it more bluntly. People have asked me time and time again, why do you stay? Why do you stay? And I look at them and I'm like, how can I go? What are you going to do? I mean, you're going to rush off to the coast and hope they don't get you from the middle nationally? It's just not the way it works in this country. And if you think you can't change people's minds, then you're not talking, they're not listening, we're not doing enough. Because it happens all the time when I have the opportunity to speak with people in a language they can understand.
I was thinking about your comments about acknowledging that people are that Americans are people of faith. And I remember a few years ago, I gave a speech at the Texas State Fair, and it was very well received, no objection or anything like that. The very next day, I flew to Los Angeles and gave a speech here at UCLA, outdoors at a rally. And about 20 or 30 protesters came out and demonstrated against me. And I thought, well, isn't this shocking? You wouldn't have expected here in Los Angeles that people would come out to protest a gay speaker, but in Texas there was no problem at the state fair. So we never know how many red staters are in blue states and how many blue staters are in red states. We need to keep that in mind. Our next and last speaker, final but not least speaker, I should say, is Feldblum. And I have known for many, many years, back in the days when we were both working on legalizing, actually including gays and lesbians the right to serve in the military, and Hai was one of the people who was instrumental in working on that. She's also instrumental in the Americans with Disabilities Act, and she is a professor at Georgetown University Law Center. Hai Feldblum.
Of course, I'll have you know we had a different plan than the don't ask, don't tell that did end up, but there it is. So, yes, absolutely. So I'm sort of I had the Keith Boykin denial mode as well after the election. I had spent 4 days in Florida canvassing and then came back and no newspapers, no NPR, I even stopped listening to country music radio, okay? Because but then I figured, okay, it's time to re-engage. And in fact, this talk here, for me, is sort of my first moment of re-engaging. So thank you for holding it now and maybe not 2 days after the election. Okay, so I think, and you've heard tonight, I think the data can show that this was not all about moral values. But I still think it's worth talking about moral values for two reasons. Number one, to a certain extent, it's going to become part of the popular wisdom, whether it's true or not. We've already heard that truth and political reality, right, may not have much to do with each other. So it's going to become part of the political wisdom, and so I think we need to have a coherent response to it, if we can, other than it's not true. Okay? Two, to a certain extent, it is true, not in the way that the conservative Republicans are trying to paint it, but in the more nuanced way that you just heard about tonight from Ken Sherrill in some of his pieces, from really all the folks in terms of the Southern evangelicals, people of faith, the anecdotes that you heard, okay? There is some piece of truth around moral values and how people vote that I think it behooves us to think about. Now, here's what I think we need to worry about, which is why I think it's useful to have a coherent response other than it's not true. I think we do need to worry about some Democrats becoming apprehensive of the seeming equivalence of gay rights, particularly marriage for same-sex couples, with the absence of moral values in the eyes of the electorate. That they're going to be apprehensive about this equivalence and then think that they need to distance themselves from gay rights. Okay, it's more like the Tom Daschle loss. You know, that even though there are many reasons why he lost, the fact that maybe he was a little too liberal on some of the stuff becomes in their brain conjoined with losing in the electorate. And that would be bad. Okay, I can tell you, as someone who's been working in Washington for 20 years, that would be bad. Now, the fact is, and I can also tell you, we can do it in the Q&A, I'm not going to spend time here, that I actually don't think that this election is going to make any difference on the things we've been working on. I mean, before, we had Repubs in both House and Senate, Repubs in the White House, you know. The federal marriage amendment, I do not think is going to go any further. It's not going to get the 2/3. I think ENDA, it's good we spent time this summer having ENDA pushing HRC, which it agreed to do, to not support an ENDA that was not trans-inclusive. You know, even if you had Kerry in the White House, so long as the House would have stayed Republican, ENDA wasn't going any further. So I think this gives us the time to do what we need to do on a trans-inclusive ENDA. I think hate crimes, we should be not spending so much efforts. But anyway, that's, in terms of actual reality in Washington, I don't think this election changes it dramatically. But I do think it would be useful if this election was a wake-up call to us to have a systematic, coherent, strategically smart, and positive response to the issue of moral values. And you will see in that what I will lay out, I think that this strategically smart response requires targeted funding. So I don't think we should be letting go of Washington and LA and New York and really any other place where money can be raised to make change. Not to the exclusion of what Martin talked about, but it's still necessary. Okay, let me say that almost a decade ago, in 1995, I wrote a piece called Devlin Revisited, Sexual Orientation, Morality, and the Law. And in that piece, I deconstructed some of my own testimony in support of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, a bill that I had worked on. I often say I don't have kids, I have laws, and so ENDA is like this, been in utero since 1993. A little difference between kids and laws. But, you know, when I testified on behalf of ENDA, I didn't say you should support this bill because gay people are morally equivalent to straight people. Gay sex is morally equivalent to heterosexual sex. I didn't say that. We use the neutral terms of equality. In fact, we affirmatively, the gay movement, legal and politically, affirmatively says, you should vote for this bill even if you don't think homosexuals are really morally okay, because they should just have equality. Okay, and I continued to write about that over the course of 10 years, and you've got one of the pieces. It's rare that I've actually been on a panel where there have been other panelists who have actually started to say the same thing, so I'm thrilled. Now, the thing is, though, I was always very coy about whether we should really aggressively have a strategy of saying this in the public arena. Okay, I would say, you know, it's very important to keep fighting on what I call battleground number 2. Okay, battleground number 1 was where the weapons were moral values. And mostly the gay legal and political movement would always absent themselves from that battleground because they figured they couldn't win, and they would just play on this other battleground, battleground number 2, where moral value arguments were banished. Right? Because that's the liberal view, is that government is not supposed to choose among competing visions of the good and push forward some vision of the good. It's supposed to only have space for pluralistic visions of the good. Okay? So moral value arguments don't play in that battleground. So my feeling was that the gay legal movement had basically decided to absent themselves from battleground 1, where moral values were in play, and only play on the battleground that they felt they could win. And let me tell you, I have a lot of respect for battleground number 2. I've played in it for 15, 20 years. On battleground number 2, which is where you engage with equality arguments, is one that gay people have in fact made significant advances. We should not abandon battleground number 2. We should not abandon our strategic plans in winning on battleground number 2. But I do think it is time now to very affirmatively and positively figure out a set of strategies for playing on battleground 1, where moral values is accepted as in play. Because I do believe that some of the real skirmishes, the real battles that have to be won on that battleground anyway. And battleground 2 will only get us so far. Okay, so how do I think about that strategic plan? Number 1, it requires a statement that gay sex is morally good. Now, you may think that might be a little crazy to go out there and saying gay sex is good. But think a second. Society definitely believes that heterosexual sex is good, right? Heterosexual sex within a certain framework, marriage. I mean, you can't get more dewy-eyed and romantic in this society about how wonderful that is. Okay, and then if you're not being cynical for the moment, I think that does reflect a correct understanding that sex is often a basic building block for intimacy, and that intimacy and connections within couples and within families are integral building blocks for a healthy society. And I spent all of Friday at the Center for Everyday Lives of Working Families here at UCLA that has a phenomenal project of videographing families. And I think it's very clear that supporting families as a political and moral unit of our society is important for a healthy society. And by the way, it was Diana Pash, who's a graduate student there, who interviewed me on Saturday that finally got me to say, yes, I think we should, in fact, really do this battle. Instead of my coy, oh, we should think about it, we should have a conversation about it. No, we should do it. Felt like engaging. All right, so here's the thing. How do we do it in a way that's strategically smart? And on this, I'm drawing from a project that I launched this past June called Workplace Flexibility 2010. Okay, the goal of the project is to change the face of the American workplace so that people can better integrate their personal lives and work lives through flexible, accommodating workplaces. Okay, that's the goal. Small, minor, right? What do you think? A few years? Right? I mean, the idea is we want to change the American workplace and we want to revolutionize social norms. Okay, this is a project that the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation is funding me to do. Workplace Flexibility 2010. So they've done lots of research that they funded in various academic disciplines, including this UCLA Center. And now my job is to bring that research to affect policy. Okay, I have 3 divisions within this project. Legislative lawyering, which is looking at all the laws affecting the workplace and does it inhibit or advance flexibility. A whole division on policy research, which, and this was the point on Friday with the UCLA Center, working with the academic researchers to figure out how to have an interactive, dialogical relationship between academic research and policy, to think creatively about that. And then I have a whole other division that is called political and social engagement. And it's about dealing with different stakeholders, unions, businesses, individuals, right? And I'm having a meeting in December, 2 days, so we can do a 3-year plan on each of these categories. Okay? This takes hard work, And it takes funding. It takes someone to whom you're responsible to for the funding to actually come up with that plan. So I think we need the same effort with regard to LGBT rights, using the weapons of moral values. And I think this effort has to happen alongside the current effort, which is using the weapons of equality. It should not supplant that effort. It should supplement it. It should complement it. Because the fact is, I think we have a pretty good track going right now, track number one, that in fact has these components of legislative lawyering, policy research, and political and social engagements on the equality model. They may not give them exactly these names, but I think the components are there, and I think it's incredibly important to continue supporting that track. But then we need a second track. And I think the second track has to be based on the following principles. 1, moral values are important to a healthy society. 2, intimate relationships between individuals and in family structures are critical moral and political units that can create a healthy society. And I credit this to the UCLA Center that I was visiting on Friday. 3, it's the government's responsibility to nurture these moral and political units. 4, people in opposite-sex relationships and people in same-sex relationships equally embody this moral good and equally deserve support from public policies. Okay, so a subset of this would be gay sex is just as good as heterosexual sex, right? And also gay people, just like straight people, are more than just about sex. And 5, our current public policies undermine the moral and political unit of same-sex couples and families, and that's a moral wrong that needs to be rectified. With those principles, I think you then need the components of legislative lawyering, policy research, and political and social engagement, and you need someone to fund and demand a 3-year plan on each of those components. So here's my bottom line. There is a war that needs to be fought. And it's not a war overseas where we're killing people in the name of liberating them. It is a war right here at home where we need to convince people that morality demands full equality for gay people. And with apologies to those of you that are not Star Trek fans, when I finished writing this, I couldn't resist writing, as Captain Picard would say, number 1, engage.
Thank you.
Or better yet, number 1, make it so.
Thank you, Hai. What I want to do is I want to get right into the questions, and I know some of you out there have some thought-provoking questions you'd like to ask to our panelists today. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then I'll ask you to come over here so you can, if you don't mind, so you can, we can get you on camera. Thank you. You can be next.
I guess my question is, there was a comment that there was complaints about the marriage rights being too fast, too soon. And I feel that the argument there is not a solid argument, because there's the constitutional amendment, which could make everything moot. And whether we want to admit it, that it's going to happen in the next 4 years, if the Christian right gets more mobilized, it could possibly happen. My question is, wouldn't it be a better strategy to let's wait out some of these older and traditional voters who are going to pass away in the next 10 to 20 years? And since the young people and the middle-aged people are more supportive of gay marriage, wouldn't it be a better strategy to let's go for domestic partnerships, let's go for civil unions, but let's back off of gay marriage until that segment of our society has passed off and we can have voter support for gay marriage?
Okay, what we're going to do in order to facilitate this, we'll have 1 or 2 people who want to respond. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. So we, okay. Okay, why don't we start with David first?
I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think the analogy with racial issues is an instructive one in this respect, because if you look at the trend in public opinion on all of the racial issues that were at the core of the Jim Crow segregationist system back in the 30 or 40 years ago, and they uniformly track a liberalizing trend over time. I guess if you want to do it this way, that the deteriorating support one after another, and all those different issues, the support for segregationism deteriorated at different rates across different issues. The one that took the longest and still shows the residual significant levels of support is racial intermarriage. That was the issue that Gunnar Myrdal in American Dilemma had identified as the issue that he thought was going to be the most difficult to change. Now, at this point, there was a very large majority in favor of laws against racial intermarriage in the early 1960s. And that number now, I think, is somewhere around 15 or 20% who are in favor of laws prohibiting racial intermarriage. But that's a huge change in just 40 years. So, I mean, I just offered that as a possible parallel and as some indication of the sensitivity of that issue. I can't get behind it myself. I don't know why it's so sensitive from my own experience, but I'm one of those young voters that already agree with it.
Ken?
Yeah. I think a lot of what David says is right. One thing that strikes me about this too much, too soon, too fast is that was the language we heard in 1966. The Civil Rights Act of '64 was okay. The Voting Rights Act was okay. And then came open housing. And the shit hit the fan. And while today there are laws on the books in much of the country prohibiting discrimination in housing, substantial residential segregation remains. And the opportunity to get redress is rather limited. And the pessimist in me wonders if we've hit one of those roadblocks, only perhaps significantly worse in terms of movement to amend, if not the United States Constitution, an awful lot of state constitutions in a way that will deprive full equality. But there's a second point that I'm concerned about, which I don't think that it's possible to follow your strategy. And the reason why I think it's not possible to wait is that same-sex marriage has never been a leadership-driven issue in the gay community, just as military service never was leadership-driven. Human rights campaign and groups of that sort knew that this was a losing issue, the same way that Karl Rove knew it was a losing issue, and they didn't push it because they were afraid of the backlash. What happened was that individuals who wanted to assert their rights went to court, and what happened was that lawyers who were passionately committed to justice represented them. And you are not going to stop people from fighting for their rights, as much as the leadership of the movement might like them to, because in fact, it's a loser. It's a loser for some period of time, but you can't control individual people who know that their rights are being denied them.
Let me ask a question just about the second, or the premise behind what I thought you were saying, which is the notion that there's a generational divide, and if we just let one generation pass away, then that somehow will change things. Is there any evidence that that's likely? I mean, when I think about the civil rights history, I think, I don't think, as Dr. King said, that time automatically makes change happen. It's what people do with time that creates change. Is there any evidence, or any likelihood that just letting time pass will encourage a change in behavior? Or in thoughts, rather?
Yeah, go ahead.
There is definitely a generational divide. When you look at the 18 to 29-year-olds versus the 65 years and older cohort, there is much more tolerance within the younger community than there is the older community. But in terms of marriage, which is kind of interesting, I think I agree with Hi. I didn't know how to pronounce your name.
That's right.
That means good luck or?
Life.
Life, right? When you talk about equality, even the conservatives believe in equality. There is housing laws, affirmative action jobs that you can't be discriminated against. But when it comes to marriage, that's more in terms of evoking God, and that it's not only a state issue, but it's a religious issue. Because when you get married in the eyes of God, and they don't believe that that it should be, they don't believe in homosexuality to begin with, so how can they believe in marriage? And I think that is a really big struggle for the gay community, to how do you get beyond that?
Okay, I think Hai has an answer, and then we have another question.
I don't know about an answer, but absolutely, the statistics show that there is a difference in the generations, but to pick the questioner's question was, wouldn't it have been better, given that, to basically put a brake on the push for marriage equality? And Ken's answer was, well, you couldn't have done that because it was just individually driven. And I just want to add just a little more gloss or addition to that, as someone who sat in some of those, movement leader conversations. At least within the Gay Legal Roundtable, which has been meeting, for over at least 15 years that I've been going, there's no doubt that in the beginning, the lawyers were very clear about not wanting to have either a marriage case or a military case in terms of doing equal protection, because it seemed a loser in terms of legal stuff. And there's no doubt that the marriage push in Hawaii was very much an individual push, not supported by the gay legal groups. But from 1998 already, we were having very systematic conversations about where to bring marriage challenges. Now, it could have been because people felt, look, individuals are going to be doing it anyway, so let's us think about what states we want to do it in. There's a very deliberate choice to go with Vermont first, very deliberate choice to go with Massachusetts. So when you had said, like, the two best friends are Osama bin Laden and the couple in Massachusetts, it really wasn't the couple themselves. It was the leadership, the legal movement. I can tell you, if in 1998 I had said, oh, I don't think we should bring this case because in 2004 that could throw the election to Bush, really, that would not have had much traction. But more importantly, I don't think that pulling back and not bringing the conversation into the public domain is a good idea. Because it's not just time that will do it. It's not. So I think, and there was another strategic decision when the Massachusetts case was being argued about whether to say we must have marriage versus civil union. And on that, I think there was some question, personally, my own personal opinion. But I know we would not have gotten as far as we've gotten in the public debate if we weren't having this public debate. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, I also disagree with it too much too soon, and we should not let anyone peg the election results on the fact of being it too soon, too much. And I think Ken Sherrill's work and others is very important in making that fact clear.
Thank you.
It was good to hear, Marty, and from some of the questioners, some questions about what we can do within the Republican Party, but I'm curious to hear some comment about what could be done within the Democratic Party, as many of the leaders seem to be ready to just totally forsake the lesbian and gay people.
Trying to fight the cause of equality for gays and lesbians on the issue of gay marriage, it may be a little bit like trying to fight the cause in favor of choice on the basis of partial birth abortion. You don't want to stake out you want to stake out what you're hoping for at the moment in terms of which part of the agenda is realistic. And as I say, I think there are a number of issues where there's still a lot of progress that can be made that are more realistic than gay marriage, and which I don't think Democrats would. I don't think Kerry wanted to go around talking about partial birth abortion all the time, but he certainly is happy to talk about choice. And I think you can draw the analogy with the range of issues on the gay and lesbian agenda as well.
Well, no surprise that John Davidson would ask both a very good and direct question. And I would say three things in response. One is, one has to say to the Democratic Party, it's not true. Okay? And that's part of what you heard tonight. It's too facile to say it was just gay marriage. Okay? It's just not true. Number two, to say, and if it were true, shame on you for saying that gay people should therefore withdraw, as if it's somehow their fault. To absolutely say that too much too soon is saying that's not really being real about how gay people are going to live their lives. Okay? But then the third is to say, and you know what? You weren't really helpful in actually addressing this issue. You know, we understand that you need to say, oh, marriage is like a states' rights issue. But you know what? States' rights, not such a great thing in terms of civil rights. You know, you gotta say, it doesn't help when you oppose the federal marriage amendment, all because of the second sentence, because of it imposing on that. No, no one was making the direct out arguments about it's wrong. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think we need to do a three-part answer. A, it's not true. B, if it were true, so what? And C, you need to help us more in making it not true in the places that it was true.
Thank you, Heidi. Martin.
Well, I'm going to guess I may be the lone Republican on this panel, as I usually am. So here's my advice to the Democratic Party. Find your value system.
Right.
You may have it, but you need to articulate it, you need to own it, and you need to communicate it to the rest of America. When I hear people talk about values and morals, that's what I hear. When I talk to Bush, he may sound stupid, but when I walk away, I know what he said. But that is a point. What is your value system? Define it, own it, communicate it. The second thing is hold Democrats accountable. How can Feinstein say stuff like that? I've sat on a panel before with Bernie Frank, and I'm literally sometimes I'm taking the liberal position, and he is like, no, slow, 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 and I'm like, you're crazy. And so the Democratic Party, the GLBT people in the Democratic Party have got to hold candidates, have got to hold the party apparatus accountable.
Thank you very much, Martin. We are out of time. I'd like to thank all the panelists. This is not the end of the conversation, of course. This is a dialogue that will continue on for not only the next 4 years, but for years thereafter. But I do want to say in closing, President Bush said during the campaign with regard to Iraq that you can't win a war in the war on terror. He said, you can't win a war if you don't believe you're fighting one. So for those who believe that there is a culture war on, perhaps we have to rethink whether we are actually fighting such a war. Thank you very much.